Coffee rings on cheap manila paper tell a story of dying love better than any court document ever could. Clara stared at the damp, brown circle soaking into the divorce papers, listening to the frantic, caffeinated bounce of Parker's knee under the glass table. The air smelled of his stale aerosol deodorant and the sharp, funeral parlor florals of his mother pacing in the next room. 5 years of biting her tongue, hiding a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire, just to be tossed aside for a mid-tier promotion. She didn't feel heartbroken. She felt the heavy, cold metal of her pen and smiled. Coffee stains dotted the manila folder like rusted coins. Clara stared at the damp ring spreading into the thick paper, focusing on the way the fibers darkened and warped. It was easier to look at the stain than at the man sitting across from her. Parker's leg was bouncing under the glass dining table, a rhythmic, frantic twitch that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the cheap ceramic sugar bowl resting between them. He was wearing his gray suit, the one he bought when he made junior director. It was a fraction too tight across the shoulders, a detail that used to endear him to her, making him look like a little boy playing dress-up. Now, it just made him look desperate. "If you could just sign at the bottom," Parker said. His voice clipped. He tapped a heavy, gold-plated pen against the glass. It was a gift from his mother, a ridiculous, ostentatious thing that smelled faintly of brass polish and arrogance. "My lawyer said we can bypass arbitration if we just file it cleanly." Clara didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she rubbed the pad of her thumb over the frayed cuff of her gray wool sweater. The wool was scratchy. She liked it that way. It was grounded, real, cleanly, Clara repeated. The word felt like chalk in her mouth. "Look, Clara, let's not drag this out into some dramatic ordeal." Parker sighed, leaning back in his chair. He checked his reflection in the dark screen of his phone, quickly smoothing a stray hair near his temple. "It's been a long time coming. We're on different paths. You're comfortable where you are, and I have a trajectory, a certain standard I need to maintain." Trajectory. He had started using corporate buzzwords at the breakfast table about a year ago, right around the time his mother, Evelyn, convinced him that Clara was an anchor, dragging down his social potential. From the living room, a deliberate, theatrical throat-clearing echoed into the kitchen. Evelyn was sitting on the beige sectional sofa, leafing through an architectural digest, the sharp scent of her signature perfume, something heavily floral that always reminded Clara of funeral homes and gin, wafted into the kitchen, overpowering the smell of stale coffee. "Parker, darling, don't let her stall," Evelyn called out, not bothering to lower her voice. The rustle of glossy magazine pages punctuated her sentence. "The notary closes at 5, and frankly, this house is depressing me." Clara finally looked up. Parker's face flushed, a mottled red creeping up his neck. He was embarrassed, but not enough to defend her. He never was. For a fleeting second, Clara felt the familiar, sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. It was a pathetic, involuntary reaction. She wasn't heartbroken that he was leaving. She was mourning the sheer, unadulterated waste of 5 years. 5 years of biting her tongue. 5 years of pretending to be smaller, simpler, just so Parker could feel like the man of the house. When they met, she was in the brutal early stages of scaling her logistics network. She was sleeping 3 hours a night on a stained mattress in a warehouse office, eating cold soup from cans. Parker had been a low-level analyst who bought her a coffee when she looked like she was about to pass out in a cafe. He had been kind. She hid the company from him initially because it was a chaotic, debt-ridden mess. When the mess turned into a regional monopoly, then a national infrastructure backbone, then a multi-billion-dollar corporate beast known quietly as the Oakhaven Group, she kept it hidden for a different reason. She wanted a sanctuary, a normal life with a normal man who didn't look at her like a walking ATM. She had wanted to be just Clara, but just Clara wasn't enough for Parker. Just Clara wore thrifted sweaters, drove a 10-year-old Volvo, and worked vaguely in freight tracking. Just Clara was an embarrassment at his corporate mixers. "I'm not stalling," Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that she usually reserved for boardrooms. It startled Parker. He blinked, his bouncing leg coming to an abrupt halt. She reached out and took the gold pen. The metal was cold and absurdly heavy. She flipped to the last page. The legal jargon blurred together. Irreconcilable differences. Waiver of spousal support. Division of minimal shared assets. He was generously leaving her the 10-year-old Volvo and giving her a payout of $10,000, a sum his mother likely fronted, to quietly disappear. "You're sure about this, Parker?" Clara asked, the tip of the pen hovering over the dotted line. "No turning back. It's for the best," he said, shifting his gaze to the microwave clock. He couldn't even look her in the eye. "It's just business, Clara. Nothing personal. Just business." A strange, dark bubble of amusement popped in Clara's chest. The nausea faded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She pressed the pen to the paper. The nib scratched loudly against the grain. She signed her name in quick, fluid strokes. Clara Dean. No longer Clara Hughes. She pushed the folder back across the glass. It made a sharp squeak. "Done," she breathed out. Parker exhaled a loud, shaky breath, snatching the folder with eager hands. "Great. Good. I'll have the movers here tomorrow for my stuff. You have until the end of the month to vacate. The landlord already knows. I'll be out by tonight," Clara said, standing up. The chair legs scraped harshly against the linoleum. Evelyn appeared in the archway, a half-empty glass of Pinot Grigio in her hand, despite it barely being noon. She wore a tailored beige blazer that looked stiff enough to double as armor. Her lips were pursed in a thin, victorious line. "Probably for the best," Evelyn said, taking a slow sip. "You can take those awful mismatched plates. Parker won't be needing them where he's going. Oh, and Clara, do try to find a nice, modest apartment. Don't go blowing that settlement money on foolish things. You've never been good with finances." Clara looked at her ex-mother-in-law. She noticed the slight tremor in Evelyn's hand, the heavy application of concealer under her eyes, the desperate clinging to a middle-class status they were secretly drowning to maintain. Clara owned the apartment building they currently lived in. She bought it 3 years ago through a proxy firm, just so the landlord would stop bothering Parker about late rent. "I'll keep that in mind, Evelyn," Clara said gently. She turned her back on them and walked toward the stairs. She had packing to do. The bedroom smelled like Parker's aerosol deodorant and stale air. Clara pulled 3 large cardboard boxes from the back of the closet, unfolding them with practiced, aggressive snaps. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of afternoon sunlight, cutting through the blinds. She didn't have much. That was the irony of being unfathomably wealthy, but deeply paranoid about being used. She had stripped her physical life down to the absolute bare minimum. A handful of comfortable clothes, a few worn paperback novels, Her heavy-duty laptop, which looked like a brick, but contained encrypted access to global offshore accounts, and a small wooden jewelry box. She tossed her jeans and oversized sweaters into the first box. The fabric made soft, muted thuds against the cardboard. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't Parker. His footsteps were always hurried. It was Chloe, Parker's younger sister. Chloe leaned against the doorframe, chewing a piece of spearmint gum with a loud, rhythmic snap. She was dressed in head-to-toe athleisure that cost more than Parker's monthly car payment. Most of it bought on credit cards Clara knew were maxed out. "So, you're actually leaving," Chloe said, crossing her arms. "I thought you'd put up more of a fight. Cry, beg, maybe threaten to take the TV." Clara didn't stop packing. She wrapped a ceramic mug in a t-shirt and placed it gently in the box. "You can have the TV, Chloe. The pixels are dying in the left corner anyway. Parker's getting a promotion," Chloe blurted out, unable to hold back the boast. "He's going to be senior VP. He's handling the new harbor redevelopment pitch. He's going to be making 6 figures. "That's nice," Clara said. Her voice was entirely flat. She knew about the harbor redevelopment. It was a massive, urban renewal project. What Chloe and Parker didn't know was that Oak Haven Group owned 60% of the waterfront acreage. Parker's firm wasn't leading the project. They were one of 12 desperate mid-tier developers begging Oak Haven for the contract. "It is nice," Chloe sneered, stepping into the room. The scent of cheap mint and heavy vanilla lotion filled the space. "He needs a wife who can host dinners, who knows how to dress, who doesn't embarrass him in front of the partners by wearing combat boots to a steakhouse. You guys were just a mismatch. He's prime steak, Clara. You're canned tuna." Clara paused. She held a stack of worn paperbacks in her hands. She looked at Chloe, really looked at her. The girl was 24, deeply insecure, drowning in consumer debt, and parroting her mother's venom because she had nothing original in her own head. Clara felt a profound, exhausting pity. "You're right, Chloe," Clara said softly, dropping the books into the box. "We were a mismatch." Chloe blinked, momentarily disarmed by the lack of resistance. She frowned, her chewing slowing down. "Well, good. Glad you see it." She awkwardly backed out of the room. "Don't steal the good towels," she yelled from the hallway, her bravado returning once she was safely out of eyesight. Clara finished taping the boxes an hour later. 3 boxes. 5 years of a marriage reduced to 3 taped squares of corrugated cardboard. She carried them down the stairs, one by one. The house was quiet. Parker had retreated to his home office, likely pretending to work while furiously texting whatever junior executive he was trying to impress. Evelyn was asleep on the sofa, a snoring beige lump. Clara loaded the boxes into the trunk of her dark blue Volvo Estate. The car was a 2012 model. The paint on the rear bumper was chipped, and the suspension creaked like an arthritic knee. But under the hood was a custom-built engine, and the interior was lined with bullet-resistant paneling, a requirement from her security team that she had fought against and ultimately lost. To the world, it was a soccer mom's beater. To anyone who knew what to look for, it was a tank. She slammed the trunk shut. The heavy, solid thud was the most satisfying sound she had heard all day. Parker emerged from the front door just as she was unlocking the driver's side. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller suddenly. The evening light caught the premature thinning of his hair. "So," Parker said, his voice drifting over the overgrown lawn, "you're off?" "I am." Clara didn't walk toward him. She rested her hand on the cold metal of the car door. "I transferred the $10,000 into your checking account," he said, puffing out his chest slightly. "It should clear by Monday. Use it smartly, Clara. Get some training, a certification or something. You can't just scrape by on data entry forever." Clara looked at him. She thought about telling him. Just a whisper. Just opening her banking app on her phone and watching his mind fracture as he saw a string of numbers that looked like a telephone code. The urge was a hot, sharp spike in her chest. But then she looked at his smug, condescending face, the way he stood there, genuinely believing he was a benevolent god tossing crumbs to a peasant. Telling him would validate his belief that money was the only metric of a human's worth. Letting him walk into the buzzsaw of reality completely blind, that was poetic. "Goodbye, Parker," Clara said. She got into the car. The leather seat groaned. She turned the key, and the engine purred to life. A deep, low rumble that rattled the loose gravel in the driveway. She put it in drive and pulled away without looking in the rearview mirror. As she navigated the winding suburban streets, the claustrophobia of the past 5 years began to peel off her skin. She rolled down the window. The cold evening air whipped through her hair. It smelled like damp asphalt and pine needles. She reached for the Bluetooth console, pressing a button. It dialed a secure line. It rang once. "Ms. Dean," a crisp British voice answered. It was Arthur, her chief of staff. "Arthur," Clara said, her voice shifting. The hesitant suburban wife dissolving entirely, replaced by the sharp, authoritative cadence of a CEO. "The lease on the South Side property, the one Parker Hughes resides in." "Yes, ma'am. I have the file right here." "Terminated. Standard 30-day notice. Tell the holding company to sell the building. I'm tired of looking at the maintenance reports." "Understood. Shall I route your calls to the hotel?" "No," Clara said, merging onto the highway. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a glittering, jagged teeth against the twilight. "I'm coming into the office. We have a board meeting to prepare for." "Tonight, ma'am?" "It's Friday. I have some lost time to make up for," Clara said. She killed the call. She pressed the accelerator, and the Volvo surged forward, leaving the suburbs in the dust. Monday morning smelled like ozone and expensive, dark roast espresso. The headquarters of Oakhaven Group wasn't a flashy glass spire in the financial district with a massive logo slapped on the side. It was a brutalist concrete and steel fortress in the industrial district, renovated internally to resemble a high-tech bunker. Unmarked, unimposing, utterly impenetrable. Clara walked across the polished slate floor of the executive level. The heels of her boots clicked with rhythmic, echoing precision. She wasn't wearing scratchy wool today. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, Savile Row, bespoke, entirely devoid of brand labels, but screaming of quiet, lethal wealth. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. Her assistant, Nora, fell into step beside her. Nora was a terrifyingly efficient woman in her late 40s who operated with the cold precision of a sniper. "Good morning, Clara. Welcome back," Nora said, handing her a sleek, encrypted tablet. "The European logistics transition is complete. The Port Authority in Rotterdam signed off at 4 a.m. our time." "Any friction from the union reps?" Clara asked. swiping through the data charts without breaking her stride. A minor complaint about the new automated cranes. Handled. I authorize the secondary bonus structure you outlined. Good. Clara pushed open the heavy oak doors to her office. The room was vast, dominated by a raw-edge walnut desk and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the active harbor. Massive cargo ships, tiny as toys from this height, moved like slow leviathans across the gray water. It was a chaotic ballet of global commerce, and Clara owned the stage. She sat behind the desk, the leather chair sighing under her weight. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The silence of the room was thick and expensive. It was a far cry from the constant hum of the broken refrigerator in Parker's house. What's the schedule for today? Clara asked, setting the tablet down. Nora checked her digital manifest. Standard quarterly reviews until noon. At 2 o'clock, we have the pitch meeting for the harbor redevelopment project. The acquisition team has narrowed it down to 3 local development firms. They need your final approval on the capital injection. Clara's eyes snapped open. The dull ache in her stomach from Friday had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Who are the final 3? Clara asked. Though she already knew, Nora tapped her screen. Apex Builders, Vanguard Developments, and a mid-tier firm trying to punch above their weight class, Sterling and Hayes Real Estate. Sterling and Hayes. Parker's firm. Tell me about Sterling and Hayes, Clara said, leaning back and steepling her fingers. Nora looked mildly confused by the specific interest, but didn't question it. She pulled up the dossier. Ambitious, but undercapitalized. Their debt-to-equity ratio is bordering on reckless. They are essentially betting the entire survival of their firm on securing this contract with us. If we pass, they will likely face insolvency within 6 months. Who is leading the pitch for them? A senior vice president named Richard Hayes, the co-founder, and he's bringing his new point man for the project, a recently promoted junior director. Nora squinted at the screen. A Mr. Parker Hughes. Clara let out a breath that was half a sigh, half a laugh. It was a dry, hollow sound in the large room. Parker, newly promoted, just as Chloe had bragged. He was coming here, into her fortress, to beg her company for the money to save his job and fund the lifestyle he threw her away for. Nora, Clara said quietly. Yes, Clara. I want to sit in on the 2 o'clock pitch. Nora raised an eyebrow. Clara rarely attended initial vendor pitches. She usually let her acquisitions board handle the theater and only reviewed the hard data. Are you sure? It's largely procedural. They'll just be showing us slide decks of imaginary buildings. I'm sure, Clara said, standing up and walking over to the window. She pressed her hand against the cool, thick glass. Down below, a line of semi-trucks bearing the subtle Oak Haven logo rolled out of a depot. In fact, I don't want the acquisitions board in there at all. Clear the room. It will just be me, Arthur, and the legal counsel. They're expecting a panel, Nora noted, her fingers flying across her screen to make the adjustments. They'll get what they get. Clara watched a seagull bank sharply against the wind outside the window. Oh, and Nora. Yes? Make sure the seating arrangement in the boardroom places Mr. Hughes directly across from the head of the table, directly in the light. Nora didn't ask questions. She just nodded. Consider it done. At 1:45 p.m., Parker Hughes stood in the lobby of the Oak Haven Group building, adjusting his tie. He was sweating. The lobby was intimidatingly austere. soaring concrete walls, minimalist water features, and security guards who looked like ex-military contractors. Beside him, Richard Hayes, a man who perpetually smelled of expensive cigars and nervous perspiration, was pacing. "Listen to me, Parker," Richard hissed, grabbing Parker's shoulder. "This isn't a standard pitch. Oakhaven is a ghost. We don't even know who the CEO is. They operate through a network of holding companies, but they hold the purse strings to the entire waterfront. We need this capital injection. If we don't get it, the firm goes under. Your new VP title goes under. Understand?" "I understand, Richard," Parker said, forcing a confident smile. Inside, his stomach was a twisted knot of acid. He needed this. He had dumped Clara. He had leased a new luxury apartment downtown this morning to match his new status, and his credit cards were maxed. He was playing the part of a wealthy executive, but he was financially dangling by a thread. This commission was his lifeline. We go in there, we project dominance. We show them we are the only firm capable of handling their vision," Richard said, patting his forehead with a handkerchief. A sleek woman in a tailored suit approached them. "Mr. Hayes? Mr. Hughes? Right this way. The board is ready for you." Parker took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and followed the assistant into the private elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing him inside a steel box shooting upward toward the executive suite. He checked his reflection in the polished metal doors. He looked sharp. He looked like a winner. He felt a fleeting moment of pity for Clara, probably sitting in some dingy motel room right now, counting her pennies. She just didn't have the stomach for the big leagues. The elevator chimed. The doors opened into a sprawling, hushed antechamber. "Through the double doors," the assistant said, gesturing. Richard pushed the heavy doors open, marching into the boardroom with Parker hot on his heels. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Richard boomed, slapping his leather portfolio onto the massive glass table. "We are thrilled to—" Richard stopped dead. Parker nearly bumped into him. He stepped around his boss, slapping on his most charming, aggressive sales smile. "Thank you for taking the time to—" The words died in Parker's throat. The boardroom was empty, save for 3 people sitting at the far end of the long glass table. A stoic older man in a 3-piece suit, a sharp-looking woman taking notes on a laptop, and sitting in the center, at the head of the table, bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of the floor-to-ceiling windows, was Clara. She wasn't wearing a scratchy sweater. She was wearing a suit that cost more than Parker's car. Her posture was relaxed, commanding, utterly terrifying. She was leaning back in the heavy leather chair, holding a familiar, ostentatious, gold-plated pen between her fingers. Parker's vision swam. The ringing in his ears drowned out the ambient hum of the air conditioning. He blinked, hard, convinced he was hallucinating from stress. But when he opened his eyes, she was still there. Clara stopped twirling the pen. She set it down on the glass table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She looked at Parker, her eyes completely devoid of the warmth or subservience he was used to. It was the gaze of an apex predator looking at a very small, very slow rabbit. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Clara said. Her voice, deep and resonant, filled the room. She gestured to the empty chairs directly across from her. "Please, have a seat. Let's talk about your trajectory." Silence stretched across the boardroom, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched whine of the projector, powering up in the ceiling. Richard Hayes stood frozen, his hand still hovering over his leather portfolio. He looked from Clara to Parker, then back to Clara. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a mathematical equation that had no solution. He didn't know the woman at the head of the table, but he recognized the executioner's posture. Parker didn't move. He couldn't. His gray suit, the one he thought made him look like a conqueror, suddenly felt like a straitjacket. The color had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old oatmeal. A small, involuntary tremor started in his left hand. "Sit down," Clara repeated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a dense, gravitational weight. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his tight collar. He pulled out a heavy leather chair and sank into it. "Ms. Dean, I presume," he said, his voice lacking its earlier boom. He shot a frantic sideways glance at Parker. "Parker, sit down." Parker's legs folded. He hit the chair a little too hard. The squeak of the leather sounded obscene in the quiet room. He stared at Clara. His mouth opened slightly, but only a dry rasp came out. He was looking for the woman who made his coffee 3 hours ago. She wasn't there. The woman across from him had dead, flat eyes. "Mr. Hayes," Clara said, leaning forward and resting her forearms on the glass. The gold pen was still there, sitting exactly halfway between her and Parker. "I reviewed your firm's preliminary file. You're asking for an $80 million capital injection to break ground on Sectors 4 and 5 of the Harbor Project." "Yes, exactly," Richard said, eagerly seizing the lifeline of business talk. He flipped open his portfolio, his hands shaking slightly. "And we believe our structural modeling is entirely unique." "I didn't ask you, Richard," Clara interrupted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Richard snapped his mouth shut. A flush of humiliated anger crept up his neck, but he bit his tongue. He was 72 hours away from missing payroll. Clara shifted her gaze entirely to Parker. The silence returned, heavier this time. She watched a bead of sweat form at his hairline, catch the harsh fluorescent light, and trace a slow, jagged path down his temple. "Mr. Hughes is your newly minted senior vice president," Clara said, the title tasting like ash. "The man leading this project. The man with the trajectory. Pitch to me, Parker. Show me this standard you need to maintain." Parker opened his mouth. His tongue clicked dryly against the roof of his mouth. "Clara, he stammered. The corporate vocabulary he wielded like a weapon in their kitchen completely evaporated. "What are you doing here? This is Oakhaven." "I own Oakhaven, Parker," she said. The words dropped onto the glass table like lead weights. "I built it in a warehouse while you were making spreadsheets for a firm that is currently bleeding to death. Now, pitch." Arthur, sitting to Clara's right, seamlessly slid a dense, printed financial dossier across the table. It stopped precisely in front of Parker. "Sector 4, Clara prompted. "You plan to use a composite material for the foundational pylons to save on upfront costs. Tell me how that holds up against the tidal erosion data from the last decade." Parker stared blindly at the folder. He didn't know. He had memorized the slide deck, the buzzwords, the synergy, and the urban flow. He hadn't read the engineering reports. That was for the analysts. He just wanted to sell the dream. "The composite. It's highly durable," Parker managed, his voice cracking. He sounded exactly like the frightened little boy he was. "It aligns with the city's green initiatives. It provides a..." A sustainable paradigm. Clara let out a short, hollow laugh. It held zero amusement. A sustainable paradigm, she repeated. She looked at Richard. Is this what you pay 6 figures for, Richard? Parroting brochures? She looked back at Parker. The composite degrades in high salinity water by 12% annually. In 8 years, the waterfront collapses. You're asking me to fund a liability. We can pivot to reinforced concrete, Richard blurted out, desperate to salvage the room. The numbers can be adjusted. With what money? Clara asked sharply. She tapped the glass with her index finger. Your debt-to-equity ratio is 4-to-1. You have 3 active lawsuits from subcontractors claiming non-payment on the West Side build. You are sitting on a house of cards, Richard. And you brought a matchstick to sell me a fire extinguisher. Richard looked at Parker. The desperation in the older man's eyes curdled into raw, self-preserving fury. You said you had an in, Richard hissed at Parker, the whisper slicing through the air. You said you understood the market dynamics. Parker looked at Clara. His eyes were wide, pleading. He was begging her, silently, to stop, to be the Clara who let him win arguments just to keep the peace. But the peace was gone. Your firm is a liability, gentlemen, Clara said. She sat back, the leather chair groaning. The adrenaline that had spiked in her veins was fading, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. She had thought this would feel good, slicing him open in the boardroom. But looking at Parker now, sweating, humiliated, stripped of his arrogant veneer, she just felt tired. He wasn't a titan to be slain. He was just a mediocre man. We are declining your pitch, Clara said formally. Richard slumped back in his chair. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs in a single, defeated wheeze. Bankruptcy. It was over. However, Clara added, both men snapped to attention. Oakhaven is looking to expand its localized asset management portfolio, Clara continued, her tone strictly procedural. Your firm owns the leasing rights to 3 commercial blocks we need for staging. We won't fund you, but we will acquire you. Richard blinked. Acquire? A hostile buyout, Arthur clarified quietly from Clara's side. 10 cents on the dollar for your outstanding shares. We assume your debt, and we take your assets. You step down as CEO, Mr. Hayes, with a modest severance. 10 cents? Richard choked. That's an insult. It's robbery. It's salvation from Chapter 11, Clara corrected flatly. You have until Friday to review the term sheet. Arthur will provide it on your way out. She stood up. The meeting was over. She didn't look at Parker. She didn't need to. Clara, please, Parker croaked, half rising from his chair. His hands were flat on the glass. Please, my promotion, my lease. You know what I just took on. If the firm is bought out, the new parent company will restructure the executive tier, Clara said, finally meeting his eyes. And Oakhaven does not employ redundant management. You have until the end of the month to vacate your desk, Parker. I believe the landlord already knows. She turned and walked out through the private access doors. She didn't look back to see the wreckage. The penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and matte black oak. It sat 40 stories above the city, a silent, climate-controlled vacuum. Clara stood in the center of the massive kitchen, the only illumination coming from the under-cabinet lighting and the distant, sprawling glow of the city below. She opened the cardboard box resting on the marble island. The tearing of the packing tape echoed loudly. She reached past her folded wool sweaters and pulled out the ceramic mug. It was chipped on the rim. The glaze was a faded, ugly mustard yellow. She had bought it at a thrift store when she was 19, right after securing her first tiny warehouse lease. She used to drink instant coffee out of it while staring at her negative bank balance, terrified and entirely alive. She walked over to the filtered water dispenser, filled the mug, and drank. The water was crisp, tasteless, perfect. It lacked the slight metallic tang of the tap water at Parker's house. Her phone buzzed against the marble. A harsh, angry vibration. She glanced at the screen. Evelyn. It was the 5th call in 2 hours. Clara watched the phone vibrate, slowly sliding across the smooth stone. She didn't answer it. She knew exactly what Evelyn would say. The woman's worldview was too rigid to accept that the tuna had swallowed her son whole. Evelyn would spin it. She would claim Clara used Parker, that she was a vindictive, bitter woman trying to ruin a good man out of spite. Clara let the phone go to voicemail. The silence of the penthouse pressed in on her. She had spent 5 years craving quiet, desperate to escape the chaotic hum of Chloe's pop music, Evelyn's passive-aggressive sighing, and Parker's relentless, empty ambitions. Now she had her quiet. It cost her a marriage she never really had. Thursday arrived with a heavy, unseasonal downpour. The sky over the city was the color of bruised iron. Clara's town car pulled into the private underground garage of the Oak Haven building. The tires hissed against the damp concrete. As the driver put the car in park, Clara saw a figure stepping out from behind a concrete pillar near her private elevator bay. It was Parker. He was soaked. His expensive trench coat was plastered to his shoulders, dripping onto the pristine garage floor. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked feral, desperate. Clara's security detail, a broad-shouldered man named Vance, no, a man named Miller, stepped out of the passenger side instantly, his hand resting near his hip. "It's fine, Miller," Clara said through the rolled-down window. She pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the damp, echoing garage. Parker took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. He was shivering. The cold down here seeped into the bones. "How did you get down here?" Clara asked. Her voice was calm, conversational, which only seemed to unnerve him more. "I waited by the exit ramp. Slipped in behind a catering van," Parker said, his teeth chattering slightly. "I needed to see you, Clara. They wouldn't let me up to the executive floor. They treated me like a vagrant. You don't work here, Parker. You're a security risk." "I'm your husband," he shouted, the sound bouncing harshly off the concrete walls. "Ex-husband," Clara corrected. "You made sure the ink was dry on Friday. Remember, cleanly, no arbitration." Parker flinched as if she had struck him. He ran a wet hand over his face. "You set me up. You knew I was pitching to Oak Haven. You sat there in the house, packing your little boxes, knowing you were going to gut me on Monday." "I didn't set you up," Clara said, leaning against the side of the car. She crossed her arms. "I didn't force your firm to take on toxic debt. I didn't force you to lie about knowing the market. And I certainly didn't force you to divorce me because I didn't fit your aesthetic. You lied to me for 5 years," he yelled, stepping closer. Miller shifted his weight, a silent warning. Parker stopped. "You slept in my bed. You let me pay for dinner. You let my mother buy you clothes. You had billions, Clara, billions. And you let me struggle to pay the electric bill?" "I paid the electric bill, Parker," Clara said softly. "I paid the rent. I bought the building we lived in, just so you wouldn't feel the humiliation of eviction. I offered to help you start your own firm 3 years ago, and you laughed at me. You told me to stick to my little data entry job and let the men handle the real estate. Parker stared at her, his jaw working as he tried to process the reality. You bought the building? I bought your whole life, Parker. I subsidized your ego because I loved you. The admission felt raw, scratching her throat on the way out. I wanted a partner. I wanted someone who looked at me, just me in a cheap sweater, and thought I was enough. But I was never enough for you. You just wanted an accessory. I can change, Parker begged, his voice cracking. The anger drained out of him, leaving only panic. Clara, please. Richard fired me yesterday. He blamed the whole failed pitch on me. He said I antagonized you. I can't pay for the new apartment. Chloe maxed out my secondary card. I have nothing. He looked pathetic. A wet, trembling dog, begging for scraps. Clara looked at him and searched her chest for a spark of the love she used to harbor for him. She looked for the pity. She looked for the urge to fix it. There was nothing. Just a vast, cold emptiness. I left $10,000 in your checking account, Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the sound of the distant rain. Use it smartly, Parker. Get some training. You can't just scrape by on empty buzzwords forever. She turned her back to him and walked toward the elevator. Clara, he screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. The stainless steel doors of the elevator slid open. Clara stepped inside. She didn't look back as the doors closed, sealing him out of her world forever. Empty bottles of Pinot Grigio clinked against the porcelain sink as Evelyn aggressively shoved them into the recycling bin. Her hands were shaking. It was Tuesday, 4 days since Parker had returned from his pitch soaked to the bone, smelling of damp wool and absolute defeat. He hadn't left his bedroom since. Evelyn gripped the edge of the faux granite countertop. Her fingernails, usually manicured, were chipped at the edges, the pale pink polish flaking away to reveal brittle ridges beneath. The kitchen felt different now. The ambient hum of the refrigerator, which used to be a comforting backdrop of domesticity, now sounded like a countdown. Footsteps dragged down the stairs. Heavy, defeated, Parker shuffled into the kitchen. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a t-shirt that had a faint, yellowed sweat stain around the collar. The man who had meticulously ironed his pocket squares a week ago was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who hadn't shaved in days. Did you call her again? Evelyn asked, her voice tight, hovering dangerously between maternal concern and frantic anger. Parker walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and put his mouth directly under the stream. He drank like a dying man, water spilling down his chin. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Her number is disconnected, Parker rasped. Or she blocked me. It just goes to a dead tone. This is absurd. Evelyn slammed her hand flat against the counter. The sharp smack made Parker flinch. She is throwing a temper tantrum. Women like Clara, mousy, unrefined women, they don't own multi-billion-dollar syndicates. It's a trick. Richard fired you because he's a coward looking for a scapegoat, and Clara is just playing some twisted game with her settlement money. Parker looked at his mother. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering. For the first time in his life, the veil lifted, and he saw Evelyn not as a matriarch of high society, but as a terrified, aging woman clinging to a raft made of maxed-out credit cards and country club lies. Mom, Parker said. The word sounded like a tire deflating. I looked up the corporate filings. Oakhaven Group. The CEO is a shell entity, but the primary signatory on the local holdings, it's her, Clara Dean. She owns this house. Proxy, Evelyn snapped, waving her hand dismissively. She grabbed a half-empty glass of wine from the island. Someone is using her name. She probably let some shady developer use her identity for a tax write-off. A sharp, rapid knocking at the front door severed the argument. Chloe's voice echoed from the living room, muffled by the loud reality TV show playing on the screen. "Someone's at the door. I'm doing my nails." Evelyn smoothed her tailored blouse, fixed a tight, polite smile on her face, and marched towards the foyer. Parker stayed in the kitchen, his stomach turned over. He knew the rhythm of that knock. It wasn't a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was the knock of consequences. "Can I help you?" Evelyn's voice drifted back, dripping with practiced condescension. "Evelyn Hughes? Parker Hughes?" A gruff, bored voice replied. "Notice to vacate. You have 72 hours. The property has been transferred to a commercial liquidator." "Excuse me? I think you have the wrong address. We have a lease." "Lease was terminated due to a change in ownership, lady. 30 days' notice was mailed. You ignored it. Now it's an eviction. Sign here." Parker closed his eyes. The kitchen smelled like stale water and sour grapes. The reality he had tried so desperately to outrun had finally caught him, pinning him to the cheap linoleum floor. Clara hadn't just divorced him. She had systematically deleted his safety net. Across the city, high above the frantic scrambling of the Hughes family, Clara sat in a leather chair that smelled of expensive hide and leather polish. Her office was freezing. She liked the air conditioning turned down low. It kept her awake, kept the edges of her mind sharp. Arthur stood across the raw-edge walnut desk, neatly stacking a pile of manila folders. "The Sterling and Hayes acquisition is finalized, Clara," Arthur said, his tone perfectly even. "Richard Hayes signed the paperwork at 9 this morning. He looked unwell." "I'm sure," Clara murmured. She was staring at a blinking cursor on her laptop screen. But she wasn't reading the spreadsheet. She was just watching the tiny vertical line blink in and out of existence. Here, gone. Here, gone. "What are your directives for the remaining staff?" Arthur asked. Clara finally looked up. Her eyes felt dry. "Liquidate the top tier. Keep the analysts and the site managers. They know the groundwork. The executives who let their firm drown in debt while playing golf can find their own way to the lifeboats." "Understood." Arthur paused, a rare break in his usual mechanical efficiency. "And the residential property on the south side?" The 30-day notice expired. The liquidation firm dropped the eviction notice this morning. Clara felt a strange, hollow thump in her chest. It wasn't guilt. It was the absolute absence of it. She thought about Parker's gray suit. She thought about the scratchy wool sweater she wore the day she signed the divorce papers. She had spent 5 years bending herself into a pretzel to fit into a Tupperware container, terrified that if she showed her true size, she would be left alone. Now she was alone anyway, but she owned the container. "Let the liquidators handle it," Clara said, turning her attention back to the screen. "If they leave anything behind, put it in a dumpster. I don't want to see a single invoice regarding that address ever again." "Yes, ma'am." Arthur nodded and turned toward the heavy oak doors. "Arthur," Clara called out, just as his hand touched the brass handle. He looked back. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," she said, closing her laptop with a soft, final click. "I'm going to the docks." Brackish water slapped against the concrete pylons of Sector 4. The smell was overpowering. A thick, industrial cocktail of diesel exhaust, salt, rotting kelp, and wet iron. Clara stood at the edge of the pier, the wind whipping her trench coat violently around her calves. She wasn't wearing a bespoke suit today. She was wearing heavy denim jeans, steel-toed boots, and a thick, dark navy sweater. Above her, massive yellow cranes cut through the gray, overcast sky like steel dinosaurs. They were moving shipping containers, red, blue, rusted orange, stacking them with terrifying precision. The ground beneath her boots vibrated with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of commerce. Millions of dollars moving by the minute. This was her heart, not the sterile penthouse, not the glass boardroom. This chaotic, deafening, metallic beast. A heavy-set foreman with a bright orange hard hat and a clipboard walked up to her, shouting over the roar of a reversing semi-truck. "Ms. Dean, we got the green light from the city on the new pylons, the reinforced concrete mix. They approved the budget amendment." "Good," Clara shouted back. "Keep the night crews on double time until the foundation is set. We can't afford a weather delay next month." The foreman tipped his hat and jogged away, barking orders into a handheld radio. Clara put her hands in her pockets. Her knuckles were cold. Back in the suburbs, an old, rusted moving truck was backed up onto the overgrown lawn of her former house. She knew this because she had seen the drone footage from her security team, ensuring the eviction went smoothly. She had watched, completely detached, as Parker dragged garbage bags full of clothes onto the driveway. She saw Evelyn arguing with a repo man taking the leased Mercedes. She saw Chloe sitting on a suitcase on the curb, scrolling on her phone, waiting for a ride that was likely never coming. They looked like ants, tiny, frantic creatures scurrying over a crumbling anthill. Parker had texted her one last time before his phone service was likely shut off. It was a long, rambling paragraph about forgiveness, about how he had lost his way, about how they could start over. He promised he didn't care about the money. He promised he just wanted his wife back. Clara had deleted the message before finishing it. He didn't want his wife back. He wanted a savior. He wanted a warm body to absorb the impact of his own failures. Clara was done being a human airbag. A large cargo ship sounded its horn, a deep, chest-rattling blast that echoed across the harbor, vibrating in Clara's teeth. She took a deep breath. The cold air stung her lungs. It felt brilliant. It felt like waking up from a 5-year coma. She was 32 years old. She had built an empire from scrap metal and sheer, unapologetic willpower. She had let a mediocre man convince her she was small, simply because he was afraid of heights. Never again. Clara turned her back to the water and walked toward her waiting car. The driver held the door open. She slid into the quiet, leather-scented interior. "Back to the office, Ms. Dean?" the driver asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "No," Clara said, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. She watched the cranes disappear behind the concrete barriers as the car accelerated. "Take me to the airport. It's time to check on the European logistics." The car merged onto the highway, leaving the city and the ghosts of the past 5 years, shrinking in the rearview mirror. There was no grand explosion, no final screaming match, no theatrical closure, just the quiet, relentless hum of tires on asphalt, moving irrevocably forward. Clara closed her eyes and let the engine carry her away. She had a world to run. That wraps up the deeply satisfying story of Clara's silent but absolute revenge. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is walking away and letting karma and a brutal reality check do the heavy lifting. If you love this grounded corporate comeback, smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of quiet power, and subscribe for more gripping narratives. Let us know in the comments, did Parker get what he deserved?